She had no memory of the journey that brought her here, only fragments, the dust of Egyptian road beneath her feet, the last glimpse of familiar faces fading into the distance, the moment she ceased to be a daughter and became possession. Hagar's world had shrunk to the walls of Abram's household. The tents were larger than any she had known, the flocks more numerous than she could count. But none of it was hers. Not the bread she baked, not the water she drew, not even the ground she slept on. She moved through her days like a shadow, silent, unnoticed, necessary but invisible. The other servants spoke to her sparingly, and when they did, it was only to give instructions or assign tasks. She was the outsider, the Egyptian among the Hebrews. Her accent marked her. Her features set her apart. Even her prayers, whispered in the darkness, rose to gods no one here acknowledged. She learned quickly that silence was survival. Keep your head down. Do not question. Do not complain. Especially do not draw the attention of Sarai. Sarai, the mistress of the household, beautiful even in her advancing years, but carrying a weight that bent her spirit, the weight of barrenness. Hagar saw it in the way Sarai's eyes would linger on the children of other women, the way her hands would instinctively move to her own empty womb, the way her voice would sharpen when she gave orders, as if cruelty could fill a void that a child could not. Hagar understood pain. She had lost her homeland, her identity, her freedom. But Sarai's pain was different. It was a pain of promise unfulfilled. The God of Abram had spoken. He had made a covenant. Descendants as numerous as the stars, they said. Yet year after year, Sarai's arms remained empty, and in a household where a woman's worth was measured by the son she bore, Sarai was failing. Hagar watched this drama unfold from the margins. She saw Abram's quiet frustration. She heard Sarai's bitter prayers. She felt the tension that thickened the air like smoke from the evening fires. But what did any of it have to do with her? She was just a servant, a foreigner, a girl with no name that mattered, no voice that would be heard, no future that extended beyond the next day's chores. She fetched water from the well. She ground grain into flour. She tended the fires and mended the tents and served the meals. Day after day, season after season, year after year, invisible, unseen, or so she thought, because in the shadows of their household, where the promise of God hung heavy and unfulfilled, a plan was forming, a desperate plan, a plan that would pull Hagar from the margins and thrust her into the center of a story that would echo through generations, a plan that would change everything. She just didn't know it yet. The night Sarai summoned her, Hagar knew something had shifted. It was in the way Sarai's voice cut through the darkness. Sharp, decisive, the voice of a woman who had made a choice she could not unmake. Hagar entered the tent, her heart pounding. In all her years of service, she had never been called alone to Sarai's presence after nightfall. She kept her eyes lowered, her hands folded, waiting. "Look at me," Sarai commanded. Hagar lifted her gaze. In the flickering lamplight, she saw something she had never seen before in her mistress's eyes. Not anger, not bitterness, but something far more dangerous. Determination born of desperation. "The Lord has kept me from having children," Sarai said, her voice steady but strained. "You know this. Everyone knows this." Hagar said nothing. What could she say? It was not her place to speak of such things. Sarai moved closer, and Hagar resisted the urge to step back. "God promised my husband descendants, sons, a nation, but my womb remains closed." She paused, and the silence stretched like a blade between them. "So I have decided, you will give him a son." The words hung in the air, incomprehensible at first. Then the meaning crashed over Hagar like a wave. "No, go to my husband," Sarai continued, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. "Sleep with him. Perhaps I can build a family through you." Hagar's mouth went dry. Her pulse thundered in her ears. She wanted to speak, to protest, to refuse. but the words lodged in her throat like stones. Did she dare? What would happen if she said no? Would she be beaten, cast out into the wilderness, sold to a passing caravan? And even if she found the courage to refuse, would it matter? She had no power here, no rights, no voice that anyone would hear. You understand what I'm asking? Sarai's eyes bore into hers. Hagar nodded slowly, though everything inside her screamed against it. Good. Sarai turned away, dismissing her with a wave of her hand. You will go to him tonight. This is not a request. Hagar, this is your duty. Hagar left the tent on trembling legs. The night air was cool against her burning cheeks, but it offered no comfort. She walked through the camp, past the dying fires, past the sleeping servants, past the life she had known. Everything was about to change. She had no choice in this. She never had. From the moment she was taken from Egypt, her body had not been her own. Her future had not been her own. And now, even this, the most intimate, the most sacred act, would be commanded of her. That night, she was given to Abram, not as a wife,
You will do as I command,
not as a
without question
beloved,
or delay.
but as a vessel, a tool to fulfill a promise that was never meant for her. And when it was done, when she returned to her mat in the servants' quarters, Hagar lay awake in the darkness and wondered if anyone, anywhere, truly saw her as more than a means to an end. She was about to find out that someone did. But first, everything would have to fall apart. The change came slowly at first, then all at once. Hagar felt it in her body, the subtle shifts, the tender heaviness, the way her stomach began to rebel against certain foods. She knew before anyone else, before Abram, before Sarai, she was carrying a child, the heir, the promise, the son that Sarai could not give. And with that knowledge came something Hagar had never felt before in this household, something dangerous and intoxicating. Power. It started small. A glance held a moment too long. A straightening of her spine as she moved through the camp. Where once she had kept her eyes lowered, now she met the gazes of the other servants. Where once she had hurried to complete her tasks, now she moved with a measured pace. She was no longer just Hagar the Egyptian. She was Hagar the mother-to-be. The other servants noticed. Their whispers followed her like shadows. Some looked at her with pity, others with envy. But all of them saw her differently now. And Sarai? Sarai saw everything. Hagar caught her mistress watching her one morning as she drew water from the well. Sarai's eyes locked onto Hagar's still flat belly, and something dark flickered across her face. Not just pain, not just jealousy, rage. But Hagar didn't lower her gaze this time. For a heartbeat, they stared at each other, two women bound by the same man, the same promise, the same household. But only one of them carried the child that would secure the future. Hagar looked away first, but not out of fear, out of something closer to contempt. Hadn't she done what Sarai could not? Hadn't she succeeded where her mistress had failed? 4 years. Sarai had been the favored one, the wife, the matriarch. But now the balance had shifted. Now Hagar held something Sarai would never possess, Abram's child growing inside her. When she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. Genesis 16, verse 4. The word fit perfectly. Despise. It was more than pride. It was a bitter satisfaction, a reversal of fortune that felt like justice. All those years of invisible servitude, all those nights of silent suffering, this was a vindication. She began to walk differently through the camp, her head held high, her hand occasionally resting on her belly, a gesture that was both protective and possessive. She lingered when Abram passed by, hoping he would notice, hoping he would acknowledge that she carried his legacy. And he did notice. His eyes softened when they fell on her. A small nod, a hint of a smile. Recognition. For the first time in her life, Hagar mattered. But in the tent where Sarai dwelled, the atmosphere grew colder by the day. The silence between mistress and servant stretched taut like a rope ready to snap. Every glance was a challenge. Every word carried an edge. The household sensed it, the shift, the tension, the gathering storm. Abram felt it too, but he said nothing. What could he say? Hagar was carrying his child. Sarai was still his wife. He was caught between promise and pain, between duty and desire. And Hagar? She was too drunk on her newfound significance to see what was coming. Pride had taken root in her heart. And pride, she would soon learn, always demands a price. The breaking point came without warning. One moment, Hagar was grinding grain in the courtyard. The next, Sarai's voice sliced through the morning air like a whip. You think you're better than me now. Hagar looked up, her hands still covered in flour. Sarai stood over her, trembling with fury. The mask of composure had finally shattered. I see how you look at me.
Why
Sarai
should you be
hissed.
blessed with what I
I
cannot
see the
have?
contempt in
It
your
is not
eyes.
my doing.
You, a servant, daring to despise me. Before Hagar could respond, Sarai struck her across the face. The blow sent Hagar reeling. She tasted blood. Her hand moved instinctively to her stomach, protecting the life within. You forget your place. Sarai spat. You may carry his child, but you are still nothing. Do you hear me? Nothing. That was a beginning. What followed were days of relentless cruelty, tasks designed to exhaust, words crafted to wound. Sarai found every opportunity to remind Hagar of her status, servant, foreigner, possession. The glances that once held contempt now held pure hatred. And Abram, he saw it all but did nothing. She is your servant, he told Sarai. Do with her whatever you think best. Genesis 16, verse 6. With those words, Hagar's fate was sealed. Abram, the father of her child, the man who had promised nations and blessings, he had abandoned her to Sarai's rage. The mistreatment intensified. Heavier loads, longer hours, sharp rebuke for tasks done perfectly. Sarai's pain had transformed into something monstrous, and Hagar bore the full weight of it, until she couldn't anymore. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Hagar made her decision. She would not endure another day of this torment. She would not let her child be born into this hatred. She would run. Under the cover of darkness, she slipped away from the camp. No provisions, no plan, just her feet moving across sand and stone, carrying her away from the only shelter she knew. The wilderness swallowed her whole. By dawn, she was miles from Abram's tents. Her legs ached, her throat burned with thirst. But she kept moving, driven by something between desperation and determination. Where was she going? She didn't know. Back to Egypt? It was impossible. Weeks of travel through hostile territory. But forward, there was nothing ahead but emptiness. Still, she walked. The sun climbed higher, merciless and unforgiving. Heat rippled off the sand. Her breath came in ragged gasps. Her vision blurred. And then she saw it, a spring. Water. Life. She collapsed beside it, her hands plunging into the cool liquid, drinking deeply. She sat there, exhausted, her back against a rock, her hand on her belly. She had escaped. But escaped to what? The wilderness stretched endlessly in every direction. No food, no shelter, no path forward. And she was pregnant, alone, with nowhere to turn. For the first time since she fled, tears came. Not tears of relief, but of realization. She had run from cruelty, but she had run straight into death. What kind of life could she offer her child here? What kind of future? She closed her eyes, letting the tears fall freely now. She had never felt more alone, more unseen, more forgotten. But she was not alone. Someone was watching, and he was about to speak her name. The voice came from nowhere and everywhere at once. Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from, and where are you going? She gasped, her eyes snapping open. She looked around wildly, nothing but sand and sky and the spring beside her. But the presence was undeniable. Someone was here, and then she saw him, a figure standing near the water's edge, not a traveler, not a wanderer, something else entirely. The air around him seemed to shimmer with weight and authority. His eyes held depth she could not fathom. This was no ordinary man. This was the angel of the Lord, and he had called her by name, not the Egyptian, not the servant, not that woman. Hagar. Her throat tightened. When was the last time someone had spoken her name with such knowledge, such intimacy? In Abram's household, she had been invisible. Hey, in the middle of nowhere, she was seen. "I'm running away from my mistress Sarai," she whispered, her voice breaking. The angel's gaze did not waver. There was no judgment in his eyes, no condemnation, only a knowing that pierced deeper than any human understanding. "Go back to your mistress and submit to her," he said. The word struck like a blow. Go back? To the cruelty? To the hatred? To the woman who had made her life unbearable? But before she could protest, the angel continued, and his next words changed everything. "I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count." Genesis 16, verse 10. Hagar's breath caught. Descendants. A future. Not just for Abram, not just for Sarai, but for her. "You are now pregnant, and you will give birth to a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery." Genesis 16, verse 11. Ishmael. God hears. The angel spoke of her son's destiny, wild and free, a man who would not bow easily, whose descendants would rise strong. But it was not the promise of nations that undid her. It was something simpler, something profound. God had heard her misery, in her pain, in her suffering, in her invisible servitude. God had been listening. Tears streamed down her face. She had thought herself forgotten, abandoned, worthless. But here, in the wilderness where no one should have known her name, the God of Abram had come looking for her. Not for Abram, not for Sarai, for her. "You are El-Roi," she whispered, the words tumbling out like confession, like a revelation. "The God who sees me." It was a name no one had ever given the Almighty before. Abraham would call him provider. Moses would call him deliverer. But Hagar, the Egyptian servant, the discarded woman, the runaway, she called him by what she needed most. The God who sees. "I have now seen the one who sees me," she said, her voice filled with wonder. Genesis 16, verse 13. The angel's presence lingered a moment longer, and then he was gone. But the spring remained, the promise remained, and the name remained. This place would be called Beer-lahai-roi, the well of the living one who sees me. A landmark not just of geography, but of grace. A monument to the moment when God looked beyond the powerful and the privileged and saw a woman society had discarded. Hagar stood slowly, her hand on her belly. She would return, not because submission was easy, not because the suffering was over, but because she was no longer alone. She had been seen. She had been heard. She had been given a promise. And the God who sees her would not forget. The journey back was different from the flight. Hagar's feet still ached. The sun still burned. But she no longer walked as a woman fleeing. She walked as a woman returning with purpose, with promise, with a name that echoed in her heart with every step. El-Roi, the God who sees me. When she crested the final ridge and saw Abram's camp sprawled across the valley, something in her chest tightened. The fear was still there. The memory of Sarai's cruelty had not faded, but it was held now in the larger truth of what she carried. Not just a child, but a destiny spoken by God himself. She descended into the camp as dusk settled. Servants stopped their work to stay. Whispers rippled through the tents like wind through grass. The runaway had returned. Abram emerged from his tent, his face unreadable. Behind him, Sarai watched from the shadows, her expression carved from stone. "I have returned." Hagar said simply, her voice steadier than she expected. Abram nodded slowly. Whether it was relief or resignation in his eyes, she could not tell. But he did not turn her away. And Sarai, for all her rage, said nothing. Perhaps she too sensed that something had changed. That Hagar carried more than just a child now. She carried a word from the divine. The months that followed were a strange silence. Sarai's cruelty had dulled, replaced by a cold distance. The household moved around Hagar like water around stone. She was no longer invisible, but she was not quite seen either, not by them. But she knew the truth. God saw her, and that was enough. Her belly grew. The child within her moved with increasing strength, as if already preparing for the wild freedom the angel had promised. She would rest her hand there and whisper the name she had been given. Ishmael. God hears you. He heard me, and he hears you. And then one night, beneath a sky scattered with stars, the pains began. The birth was hard, as all births are. But when the cries finally pierced the darkness, sharp and strong and defiant, Hagar wept, not from pain, from wonder. A son. The servants cleaned the child and placed him in her arms. She looked down at his face, still red and wrinkled, his tiny fist clenched as if ready to fight the world. And she saw it, the promise wrapped in flesh. The future God had spoken into existence. Abram came to see his son. He stood at the entrance of the tent, this man of faith who had waited so long for an heir. His eyes glistened as he looked at the boy. His name, Hagar said softly, is Ishmael. Abram nodded. He understood. God hears. The name was not just for the child. It was a testimony, a reminder that the Lord had heard the cry of a suffering woman in the wilderness and had answered. Ishmael, Abram repeated, and took his son into his arms. So Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram gave the name Ishmael to the son she had born. Abram was 8 to 6 years old when Hagar bore him Ishmael. Genesis 16 verses 15 to 16. For 13 years, Ishmael would grow in his father's house. Strong, wild, free, the firstborn son of Abram, raised with the promise whispered in the wilderness still echoing in his mother's heart. But the story was not over. God's promise to Abram had not yet been fully revealed. And when Sarah would finally conceive in her old age, everything Hagar had built would come crashing down once more. The true test was still to come. 13 years. For 13 years, Ishmael had been the son, the heir, the promise fulfilled. He grew strong under the desert sun, learning his father's ways, running wild through the camp with the confidence of a firstborn. And then everything changed. Abraham, no longer Abram, for God had renamed him, stood before his household with news that seemed impossible. Sarah, no longer Sarai, was pregnant. At 90 years old, her womb had opened. The promise God had made so many years ago was finally coming to pass. Not through Hagar, through Sarah. Hagar felt the ground shift beneath her feet. She looked at Ishmael, now nearly a man, and saw the question forming in his eyes. What did this mean for him? For them? When Isaac was born, the camp erupted in celebration. Abraham held a feast unlike any Hagar had ever seen. Laughter filled the air. Music and dancing lasted long into the night. This was the child of the covenant, the son of promise, the heir God had always intended. And Ishmael? He became the other son, the one born of human effort rather than divine intervention, the son of the servant woman. Hagar watched Sarah cradle Isaac with a fierceness that bordered on obsession. Every glance Sarah cast toward Ishmael now carried suspicion. Fear. She had waited a lifetime for this child, and she would protect his inheritance at any cost. The breaking point came on the day Isaac was weaned. Another feast, another celebration. Ishmael, now a teenage boy, watched from the edges as all attention focused on his younger half-brother. And then, perhaps out of boredom, perhaps out of bitterness, perhaps out of the thoughtlessness of youth, Ishmael mocked. It was a single moment, A laugh, a gesture, a comment that could have been harmless in any other context. But Sarah saw it, and in that instant, everything she had feared crystallized into rage. She found Abraham immediately, her voice sharp with fury. "Get rid of that slave woman and her son," she demanded. "For that woman's son will never share in the inheritance with my son Isaac." Genesis 21, verse 10. The words were a blade through Hagar's heart. That slave woman, after all these years, after bearing Abraham's firstborn, after the promise of the well, after naming God himself, she was still just that slave woman. Abraham's face crumpled. He loved Ishmael. This was his son, his flesh and blood, the boy he had raised for 13 years. How could he send him away? But that night, God spoke. "Do not be so distressed about the boy and your slave woman. Listen to whatever Sarah tells you, because it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. I will make the son of the slave into a nation also, because he is your offspring." Genesis 21, verses 12 to 13. And so, with a heavy heart, Abraham made his decision. Early the next morning, before the camp awoke, he came to Hagar. He placed a skin of water on her shoulder and some food in her hands. He looked at Ishmael, his firstborn, and something broke in his eyes. But he said nothing. No explanation, no comfort, no promise of return. Just the supplies for a journey and the unspoken command to go. Hagar turned and walked away from the only home Ishmael had ever known. Behind her, she heard no voice calling them back, no footsteps running after them, only silence. She had been cast out before and survived. She had met God in the wilderness and been sent back. But this time felt different. This time felt final. The wilderness of Beersheba was merciless. Hagar and Ishmael walked through it with no destination, only the instinct to keep moving, away from Abraham's camp, away from Sarah's hatred, away from the life they had lost. The skin of water Abraham had given them seemed generous at first, but the desert sun was relentless, and their thirst was constant. Ishmael was no longer a small child. He was a young man who needed more water, more food, more strength than Hagar could provide with the meager provisions they carried. Day after day, they wandered. The landscape stretched endlessly in every direction, sand and stone and scorching heat. No springs, no oases, no relief. And then the water ran out. Hagar shook the empty skin, hoping for even a few drops. Nothing. She looked at Ishmael, and for the first time since they left, she saw fear in his eyes. Not the fear of exile, the fear of death. "Mother," he whispered, his voice cracked and dry. She had no answer, no comfort to offer, no hope to give. They stumbled forward, but Ishmael's steps grew slower, heavier. He was weakening. The boy who had run wild through Abraham's camp, full of life and strength, was now barely able to walk. Finally, he collapsed. Hagar knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she touched his burning forehead. His lips were cracked, his breathing shallow. She tried to lift him, but he was too heavy, and she was too weak. Panic clawed at her chest. This couldn't be how it ended. Not after everything. Not after the promise at the well. Not after God himself had spoken a destiny over her son. But the desert didn't care about promises, and the sun kept burning. With the loss of her strength, Hagar dragged Ishmael to the meager shade of a bush. She laid him there, his body limp and barely responsive. She brushed the hair from his forehead, her tears falling onto his face. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." And then she did something that shattered her completely. She walked away. Not far, just about a bowshot, close enough to see him, far enough that she wouldn't have to watch him die. She sat down in the sand, her back to her son, and buried her face in her hands. "I cannot watch the boy die," she sobbed. Genesis 21, verse 16. The words tore from her throat, raw and desperate. She had survived slavery. She had survived cruelty. She had survived exile. But this, watching her child, her promised son, waste away in the wilderness while she sat powerless, this was too much. She wept loudly, her cries echoing across the empty desert. They were the cries of a mother losing everything, the cries of a woman who had been seen by God and now felt utterly abandoned. Where was El-Roi now? Where was the God who sees? She had named him. She had trusted him. She had believed his promise that Ishmael will become a great nation. But how could any of that be true if her son died here, alone and forgotten in the sand? The silence pressed down on her like a weight. No voice from heaven. No angel at the spring. No rescue. Just the sound of her own sobbing and the terrible, crushing certainty that hope had finally run out. She didn't know that God was about to answer. Not her cries, but the cries of her son. Then God heard the boy crying. Not Hagar's cries, not her desperate sobs, but the voice of her son, weak and fading, crying out from beneath the bush where she had laid him. And heaven responded. The angel of God called to Hagar from above. What is the matter, Hagar? Do not be afraid. God has heard the boy crying as he lies there. Genesis 21, verse 17. She looked up, her face streaked with tears and dust. The voice was familiar, the same presence she had encountered years ago at the spring. The same divine authority that had sent her back to Sarah's household with a promise. He had not forgotten. Lift the boy up and take him by the hand. The angel continued, for I will make him into a great nation. Genesis 21, verse 18. The words washed over her like cool water. A great nation. The promise still stood, despite the exile, despite the wilderness, despite the empty water skin and the dying sun and the hopelessness that had driven her a bowshot away. God had heard, and then something miraculous happened. God opened her eyes. It wasn't that the well appeared out of nowhere. It had been there all along, hidden in plain sight. But in her despair, in her certainty of death, she had been blind to it. Now, with divine clarity, she saw it. Water, life, salvation, just steps away. She scrambled to her feet and ran to the well. Her hands trembled as she filled the skin with cool, clear water. She ran back to Ishmael, lifted his head, and pressed the opening to his cracked lips. "Drink," she urged. "Drink, my son." The water flowed into his mouth. He swallowed once, twice. His eyes fluttered open. Color began to return to his face. Breath came easier. Life, pushed back from the edge of death, flooded into him again. Hagar held him close, tears streaming down her face, no longer tears of despair, but of overwhelming gratitude. God had heard. God had seen. God had provided. El-Roi had not abandoned them. The wilderness that should have been their grave became their home. God was with Ishmael as he grew. He learned to survive in the harshness of the desert, how to find water, how to hunt, how to live free and untamed just as the angel had prophesied years before. He became an archer, his arrows flying true across the open spaces. And in time, his mother found him a wife from Egypt, a woman from her own homeland, bringing full circle the journey that had begun when Hagar herself had been taken from that land so many years ago. Ishmael thrived in the wilderness, and true to God's promise, his descendants multiplied. 12 sons would come from him, 12 tribal rulers, just as God had spoken. A great nation rising from the servant woman and her exiled son. What Sarah meant for destruction, God transformed into destiny. What looked like abandonment was actually appointment. And the woman who had twice been cast aside became the mother of nations, not through the covenant line of Abraham and Sarah, but through the wild, free legacy of Ishmael. She had been seen. She had been heard. She had been faithful. And God had been faithful to her. From the wilderness, a new story emerged. Not the story the world expected. Not the story Sarah had written. But the story God had ordained from the moment Hagar first whispered his name at the spring. El-Roi, the God who sees. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and subscribe for more content like this. Thanks for watching.